Hi guys, welcome to the next video in our series looking at fiscal and supply side policy. In this video we're going to zoom in on supply side policies that the government could use to manage an economy. We're going to meet the concept of a supply side policy, and then our main aims with this chunk are to think about the two broad different approaches to supply side policy and then the impacts of successful supply side policies on a number of our key macroeconomic objectives. Supply side policies are all about achieving supply side improvements, and by supply side improvement we mean an improvement in our economy's productive capacity, an increase in our long run aggregate supply curve, leading to greater national income but without inflation. Now, the economists at university agree that this is a good idea because this is a policy that can be achieved essentially without trade-offs. If we manage to do this, we increase our rate of growth, we decrease our level of unemployment, we don't get inflation. We'll think about the impact on trade shortly. And so to achieve this, governments use supply side policies. That's any government policy that's designed to achieve supply side improvements. There's two basic approaches to achieving this supply side improvement, increasing the trend rate of growth, increasing our productive capacity. Interventionist policies argue that the government needs to directly achieve those supply side improvements. These policies focus on state provision, so we're thinking major infrastructure projects like transport links and nationalised industries. Whereas on the other hand, free market policies argue that the government needs to enable private firms to achieve supply side innovations. So for example, market deregulation, policies that enable markets to be innovative as easily as possible, promoting competition between firms. And the key difference is that free market policies view the government as the enabler of supply side improvements which come from the private sector, whereas interventionist policies or Keynesian policies view the government as the provider of those supply side improvements. Free market policies have been more dominant in the past few decades, and so we've seen lots of privatisation of key industries. We've seen things like reducing barriers to entry, and we've seen tax cuts to make it easier for firms to compete. Let's start by looking at these interventionist Keynesian policies. We're thinking things like government spending on education and training, subsidising research and development, spending on big infrastructure projects, motorways, railways. Now, all of these we call supply side fiscal policy because they all concern the government spending money. We spoke briefly in our look at fiscal policy about ways fiscal policy can impact on aggregate supply. Here are some really concrete ways. But government interventionist policies also involves market regulation, regulating monopolies and oligopolies, firms with lots of market power, which we'll meet in upper sixth microeconomics, in order to make sure that they're performing in an optimal way. It's traditionally involved the government directly running industries. So companies like British Gas, British Airways, or the old British Leyland were all firms that were run directly by the government. It's known as nationalised industries. There's some obvious pros to these approaches, these interventionist approaches where the government is very hands-on in achieving supply-side improvement. Some of the benefits include the fact that this is going to help us prevent the abuse of monopoly power. We're not too keen on monopolies because they can have all sorts of negative effects. Government policy to intervene in the market can prevent the abuse of monopoly power, and it can enable major infrastructure projects to happen that might not otherwise have happened. Usually, however, most economists view the government as less efficient at generating these improvements than the private sector, and the risk of greater government spending, as we've seen, is that it risks crowding out private sector investment. So on the other hand, some economists argue for free market policies, and historically supply-side economics has focused on free market policies. So we're thinking things like deregulation, removing what we call red tape, the barriers to innovation and bureaucracy, all of these hurdles that firms have to jump through. We're thinking privatisation. Firms like BT, British Telecommunications, used to be nationalised, but it's now privatised. It's run as a private firm. We're thinking tax cuts, reducing corporate taxes to incentivise the development of firms, to incentivise research and development, to incentivise firms seeking profit. The advantages of this are clear. Most investment in innovation is done by the private sector. The private sector has historically just been much better at doing this. Increasing private sector investment is likely, therefore, to lead to bigger impact than the government directly doing that investment. We'd also argue that private firms are more efficient because they have a profit motive to follow. On the other hand, if we just let the free market operate, the risk is market failure, particularly the risk of monopoly power and firms abusing that power. And so what we tend to find happening is that in the UK at the moment, generally these free market policies have dominated. Most governments have argued that the private sector is really good at generating these supply side improvements, but that there does need to be some regulation. So monopolies are very heavily regulated to make sure they're not abusing their market power. So which approach is better? Well, free market policies are borne out by the evidence. 94% of research and development spending happens by private firms. And these private firms have a profit motive, meaning they're more likely to be efficient and respond to incentives in the market. Historically, the government seems to be a poor provider. Back in the 1970s, when an awful lot of key industries were nationally run by the state, a lot of those firms arguably failed, leading to the bigger movement towards privatisation since the late 1970s. On the other hand, interventionist policies, you could argue that market failures mean that we need to intervene. Unregulated monopolies can be harmful, and the market would underprovide merit goods like education and healthcare if the government didn't step in to provide some supply-side infrastructure. Some of this major infrastructure that the economy needs to be productive will be massively underprovided by the free market. Almost every economy in the world, the government provides roads and railways. In reality, we need both approaches. The question is which one dominates, and in the past 40 years, we've emphasised free market policies, but acknowledged that the government needs to intervene as well. Let's talk about the impact of successful supply-side policy on all of our major objectives. Here's the key question for evaluation. How does supply-side policy help the government meet its major macroeconomic objectives? We might deal with questions like this: assess the importance of demand-side and supply-side policies in achieving long-run economic growth. Or evaluate the view that the most effective way for a government to achieve major supply-side improvements is to encourage free market forces. We should be able to have a decent stab at answering these questions from what we've seen already. But we need to quantify a bit more what the impact of these policies is likely to be. Why don't you pause the video and spend a few minutes planning those two questions. Based on what we've seen, what might you think? We'll come back to them at the end of the video. Great, we're going to come back to those questions in a bit, but let's move on and have a think about the impacts of some of these policies. Start with the impacts on growth. Supply-side policies are all about improving our long-run aggregate supply or improving our long-run trend rate of growth. On an economic cycle diagram, the black line is our trend. Successful supply-side improvements will increase the trend rate of growth that underlies the economic cycle. It's not short-run, it's a very long-run policy. And this is ideal because it avoids major macroeconomic conflicts. We can achieve this. This is not unlike short-run growth. If we can successfully increase the long-run trend rate of growth, we can achieve growth without a corresponding increase in inflation. What about unemployment? Well, supply-side policies can influence our natural rate of unemployment. We can show this by shifting our long-run aggregate supply curve, or perhaps slightly better, by shifting our long-run Phillips curve inwards. So the natural rate of unemployment is decreased. The rate of unemployment at which we have low inflation is decreased. We can draw it just as the diagram on the screen, or we can also whack in our short-run Phillips curve just to make it that much more sophisticated to show the examiner we know what's going on in this diagram. Just to recap, how do we do this? We're thinking things like increasing labour mobility, increasing information, improving the returns to working by improving wages and decreasing income taxes. Those sorts of things are going to deal with structural and frictional unemployment, and many of them are going to happen just as a natural byproduct of successful supply-side policies. We're likely to see firms investing more in labour, and therefore they're going to be more prepared to offer education and training. We're going to get increased wages, and all of those are going to deal in part with some of our structural and frictional issues in unemployment. What about inflation? Well, we know that supply-side improvement is going to increase our long-run aggregate supply curve, which is going to result in disinflation, or in some cases benign deflation. On the diagram it looks like deflation, but we'll normally have an increase in aggregate demand at the same time, which means we're not hugely likely to get deflation. It happens because firms are more productive and therefore their production costs and prices fall. This is likely to be disinflation, but it could be benign deflation as well. Trade is a bit trickier. On the one hand, effective supply-side policy is going to increase incomes in an economy, and that's going to mean increased expenditure on imports, worsening the balance of trade. On the flip side, though, and probably much more significant, effective supply-side policy by definition means greater productivity for UK firms. That's going to make UK exports more competitive. They're either going to be cheaper because costs go down, or they're going to be increased quality, and probably both. We're going to see more innovation, more development. That's going to be the dominant effect. Effective supply-side policy makes our firms more effective, and so it's probably going to improve our net balance of trade. Lastly, although this isn't a major macroeconomic objective, let's talk about the impact of supply-side policies on inequality. Because there's really two things going on here. Free market supply-side economics really argues that some are going to gain much more than others in the short run, because successful entrepreneurs gain much of the immediate rewards. What free market supply-side economics is really arguing is that we need to deregulate the market, make it easier for the market mechanism to work, so that when there's more incentive for investors to take a risk and establish new products, invest, innovate. And that means a small number of entrepreneurs who are really successful gain an awful lot. Extreme scenarios, think about things like Bill Gates and Microsoft. Some companies can gain huge amounts in value. But they'd also argue that the trickle-down effect suggests that everyone in an economy eventually gains from this, because the very richest then spend their money, which contributes more in the circular flow, and as a result, everybody gains. Lots of economists have criticised that. There's not as much evidence for it as we might like. UK income inequality has increased quite substantially since 1977. So whether or not this works is a little bit up for debate. We'll come more in future topics to look at this idea of trickle-down economics and the impact on inequality. But it's just worth being aware that free market supply-side economics potentially has a negative impact on inequality. Now, what I haven't done is given you a load of different examples of microeconomic policies that could be used for supply-side policy. I'm going to link some resources in the video description that will help with that. But we should by now have a good overview of supply-side policy that enable us to tackle some of these questions. We spoke about these 25 markers earlier. But crucially, when we're talking about supply-side policies, with this first one, we want to understand the difference between demand and supply-side policies. Demand-side policies are interested in increasing aggregate demand, and as we've seen, that can be really good in the short run, but in the long run tends to be hugely inflationary. It's going to be really good if we've got a negative output gap. And so we can argue for that counter-cyclical demand management Keynesian policy that we met in the previous video, where we use fiscal policy, demand-side fiscal policy, to flatten the economic cycle, improving confidence, improving stability, and putting in place optimal conditions to achieve sustainable long-run growth. But on the other hand, demand-side policies are generally short-run. They create output gaps, they're inflationary, and what we know about the expectations augmented Phillips curve suggests that in the long run, that conflicts are inevitable. Supply-side policies, however, are going to be much better because if we successfully increase our long-run aggregate supply, we manage to achieve economic growth without conflicts. But on the other hand, supply-side policies are really difficult to do. And one of the key takeaways I want you to have from this video is that it's really difficult working out how to do supply-side policies effectively. They're really long-term, they're really expensive, and therefore there's lots of uncertainty about how best to do it. This question is more about whether or not we should use free market or interventionist supply-side policies, and there's plenty in the video on the evaluation of that. Free market policies are great because the private sector is really good at investing, but there's a risk of market failure. Government intervention is good because the government can solve market failures and provide things that wouldn't otherwise be provided by the market, particularly merit goods. But on the other hand, governments tend to be inefficient, and it's harder for the government to know how to spend money. Here's one more question that we'll just chat about briefly. Evaluate the importance of fiscal policy in achieving sustainable economic growth. Now, this doesn't seem at first glance linked to supply-side policy, but remember when we talk about fiscal policy, we often talk about it in terms of demand management, but we can also talk about it in terms of supply-side fiscal policy. And if I were going to tackle this question, my main points would go along those lines. I might start by arguing that demand-side fiscal policy is not good at increasing sustainable economic growth. It just increases aggregate demand, and there's lots we can say about the downsides of positive output gaps in the long run. It's effective to achieve recovery from a recession, on the other hand, and that can be good for the long run growth of a country. And we can also argue for counter-cyclical demand management policies. Check the previous video if you're not sure what I mean by that. On the other hand, I'd probably say that supply-side fiscal policy, so spending on infrastructure, on education, on healthcare, can achieve long-run growth, but free market supply-side economics may be much better at doing that. That's just a suggested approach for how I might go about tackling that question, but why not spend some time planning it in detail and working out how we bring all of the theory we've seen in this topic into a question like that.